Modern wealth systems still begin the same way they did a century ago, with control over land. In 1906, Tulsa was growing quickly. Oil money was moving through the city, but access to ownership was uneven. Railroad tracks cut through town, separating white commercial districts from black residential areas. North of those tracks sat 40 acres of undeveloped land. No paved streets, no utilities, and no businesses. The area was largely ignored because the city had no plans to invest there. O.W. Gurley purchased the land at a moment when black residents were restricted in where they could live, build, and operate businesses. The tracks marked a boundary that shaped daily movement and long-term opportunity. The purchase gave Gurley something specific: control. Ownership allowed him to decide how the land would be used, who could lease property, and what kinds of businesses could operate there. Tulsa's oil economy generated income, but black wages rarely stayed in black hands. Money was earned in the city and spent elsewhere. Property ownership offered a way to slow that outflow. At the time, the purchase did not look ambitious. There were no buildings yet, no customers and no infrastructure, just acreage and a deed. But the transaction established a boundary. Inside it, housing, commerce, and employment could be developed deliberately. Greenwood did not begin with buildings or storefronts. It began with land ownership. O.W. Gurley was born in Alabama in the late 19th century, in a segregated economy where black advancement was limited by law and custom. Land ownership was rare. Most available work kept black families tied to agricultural labor, with little opportunity to accumulate property or savings. Education offered one of the few exits from that system. Literacy created access to teaching and clerical work, roles tied to records, documentation, and administrative process rather than land or physical labor. Gurley received a formal education and entered teaching, a profession that provided steady income and required structure. Lessons were planned, attendance recorded, and progress documented. Authority flowed through written systems. Those early experiences clarified limits quickly. Advancement depended less on effort than on proximity to institutions and the ability to operate inside their rules. By the late 1890s, Gurley entered federal service. He was appointed as a clerk in the United States Post Office Department through a presidential appointment, placing him inside one of the largest administrative systems in the country. The post office intersected with rail lines, land offices, and local governments. From inside the system, Gurley observed how information moved and how federal documentation shaped local development before private capital arrived. The position offered stability, but it also revealed limits. Advancement was narrow, and income was fixed. Long-term accumulation was unlikely. At a certain point, Gurley resigned. The shift was deliberate. He left federal service with a working understanding of how land, infrastructure, and records interacted, and with a clear conclusion: ownership, not employment, determined outcomes. Shortly after, Gurley moved west toward Indian Territory. The paperwork was behind him. The systems he had learned to operate were not. In September of 1893, the Cherokee Outlet opened to settlement. Thousands rushed into the territory, competing for land in what became one of the largest land runs in U.S. history. O.W. Gurley joined the movement, but not as a land speculator. Instead of chasing acreage, he secured a strategic corner lot in the new town site of Perry, Oklahoma. Gurley entered Perry with a dual-track operation. He served as the town's school principal, a stable public position that provided income and standing. Alongside it, he operated a general store. The store was the real engine, Homesteaders arriving in Perry were land-rich and cash-poor. They needed tools, food, clothing, and supplies immediately. Gurley stocked essentials and priced for rapid turnover. Transactions were frequent, inventory moved quickly, and credit was managed tightly. While many settlers waited for crops to mature, Gurley built a cash-based clearinghouse. Money moved daily. Liquidity mattered more than long-term yield. Over the next decade, the model worked, but by the early 1900s, constraints became visible. Perry's population stabilized, demand flattened, and Jim Crow restrictions hardened across the region, limiting how far Black-owned businesses could expand. By 1904, Gurley recognized the ceiling. He did not wait for decline. He liquidated. The store was sold, holdings were converted to cash, and capital was consolidated rather than reinvested locally. Gurley exited Perry with a mobile treasury and no fixed attachments. He watched the rail lines shift south. They pointed towards Tulsa. In 1906, Gurley arrived at the northern edge of Tulsa as the city surged from the Glen Pool oil strike. Capital was flooding in. Infrastructure followed white investment, and segregation followed everything else. North of the Frisco rail tracks lay 40 acres of undeveloped land. No streets, no utilities, and no planned investment. To white speculators downtown, the area was a geographic void. Gurley saw demand. Black families were arriving in the territory with wages, savings, and business plans, but no access to white commercial districts. Capital entered Tulsa with nowhere to anchor. Gurley executed a targeted acquisition, purchasing the 40-acre tract. Ownership established jurisdiction. The land was subdivided and sold exclusively to Black buyers. Housing, storefronts, and services were placed deliberately. This was not open development. It was controlled entry. The structure produced a closed-loop economy. And because Black residents were excluded from white businesses, money spent in Greenwood stayed there. Wages paid inside the district circulated repeatedly through rent, groceries, services, and repairs. By 1912, Gurley's original rooming house had expanded into the Gurley Hotel. It served Black travelers denied access elsewhere and hosted meetings, events, and commercial activity. It was one of the district's earliest high-yield assets. By 1913, Greenwood was no longer provisional. Brick buildings replaced wood, and businesses multiplied. Banks, doctors, pharmacies, grocery stores, and churches operated within a compact radius. Capital velocity increased. A single dollar was estimated to change hands multiple times before leaving the district. Gurley expanded his role. He developed additional businesses and acted as a private lender, supplying capital that white banks refused to provide. Financing stayed internal, and risk was distributed locally. Greenwood became dense, visible, and prosperous. Some residents accumulated wealth without ever transacting inside a white-owned institution. The system worked, but its success created exposure. By 1921, Greenwood's success was no longer contained. The district was visible, profitable, and dense with ownership. What had begun as controlled development had become proof, on paper and on the ground, of Black economic sovereignty. That visibility produced friction. On the night of May 31, 1921, a localized incident was used as a pretext for a coordinated assault on Greenwood. What followed is now known as the Tulsa Race Massacre. The attack unfolded systematically. Armed white mobs entered the district and moved block by block. Homes and businesses were looted and burned. Private aircraft were used to surveil and coordinate movement. Fires were set deliberately. The targets were not random. Commercial buildings were destroyed. Hotels, stores, offices, and professional practices were reduced to rubble. Records were lost, deeds, ledgers, inventories, documentation that established ownership and value. In less than 24 hours, the commercial infrastructure of Greenwood was eliminated. Among the losses was the Gurley Hotel, one of the district's earliest anchor assets. O.W. Gurley survived the massacre, but his holdings did not. The destruction represented a total liquidation without consent or compensation. Gurley's losses were estimated at approximately $200,000 in 1921 currency, millions in present-day value. Insurance claims were filed, but they were denied. Policies contained riot clauses. Insurers classified the event as civil unrest rather than insurable loss. The legal system offered no effective remedy. Property that had existed within formal ownership frameworks before the attack was rendered financially invisible afterward. The state provided neither protection nor restitution. Gurley eventually left Tulsa. The land he had subdivided was no longer under his control. The jurisdiction he had built was dismantled. His role in Greenwood's creation faded from public record. Yet the reckoning was not total. Greenwood proved that ownership, circulation, and control could create wealth where none was meant to exist. The system did not fail. It was destroyed. The buildings are gone, but the blueprint remains.